is going to be our first webinar on the topic of mystic minds. And it'll probably be 5, maybe 6, but probably 5 sessions like our last one was. In this series, we're going to be learning about another kind of prayer, a specific kind of spiritual activity that's called contemplative prayer or contemplation. And this is the prayer of the mystics. It's a form of meditation or contemplation for the purpose of experiencing unity with the One, what Jesus talked about in his prayers, unity with the divine, with God. But before I actually begin talking about this prayer and the thoughts of mystic minds, I thought what I would do is some definitions. So we have some terminology, and that means we're all on the same page. So the first thought is, what is a mystic? And what does that word mean? So a mystic is a person who seeks by contemplation and self-surrender to obtain unity with or absorption into the deity or the absolute. So that's quite a definition. So this is somebody who is seeking exactly what Jesus talked about, being one with God. And they seek this by contemplation and by self-surrender. So they want to actually be absorbed into God. A mystic is also one who believes in the spiritual apprehension of truth that's beyond the intellect. Clearly, we're going to see that they believe you can reach a place with God that is far beyond just thinking what our mind can accomplish. So, an example, a sentence using the word mystic would be, the poetry of the 16th century mystic St. John of the Cross is inspiring. So mystic is a person with those goals. But that brings us to the next word, because our definition said the mystic seeks by contemplation. So what exactly is contemplation? And the word contemplation is a noun. Now these are dictionary definitions, so they're kind of official. They're not just my way of thinking about these words. So contemplation is an action of looking thoughtfully at something for a long time. More to our purposes, though, it means deep, reflective thought. An example of the boy went to, or let's say the man would retire to his room for study and contemplation, right? So it's deep reflective thought. Synonyms for contemplation are thought, meditation, considering, pondering, reflecting, thinking, musing, deliberation or reverie, concentration, and introspection. It's also a state of being thought about or planned. It can refer to religious meditation. And finally, in Christian spirituality, it's a form of prayer or meditation in which a person seeks to pass beyond any kind of mental images and concepts to a direct experience of the divine. So that goes along with the definition of the mystic. So a couple of times in those definitions, you also heard the words meditate or meditation. So I want to define that also. To meditate is to think deeply or to focus one's mind for a period of time in silence or with the aid of chanting for religious or spiritual purposes or as a method of relaxation. And you're probably aware that meditating has some proven medical benefits, one of which is lowering high blood pressure, helping people to be calm, relieving depression, some other physical aspects. So it also means to think deeply or carefully about something. Our sentence example would be, he went off to meditate on a new idea. Similar words, the synonyms would be contemplate, think about, consider, ponder, reflect, engage in contemplation, be lost in thought. And this one I really like this one. Put on one's thinking cap. I haven't heard that expression in a long time. So meditate comes from a Latin word which originally meant to measure. To take the measure of something is to meditate about it. Now, I'm defining the words contemplation and meditate right at the beginning of our study because some Christians believe that to meditate is actually something different than to contemplate, and it's somehow wrong. So as we progress, we're going to see that these are just two words with the same meaning. And for those people who really like examples from sacred writings, I turn your attention to the Hebrew scriptures, the beginning of the book of Joshua, where God tells Joshua to meditate on the scriptures day and night. Now, of course, you can use meditation in the wrong way, just as you could use contemplation in the wrong way. You could meditate, for example, or contemplate the best way to rob a bank and get away with it. But those aren't the kind of meditations that we're going to be talking about. So, the definition of meditation mentioned that some meditation uses chanting. Now, in this series, I'm going to mention various methods of contemplative prayer because, of course, that's what the series is about. But I want to address this idea of chanting right at the get-go because that can be a little off-putting for some of us. Chanting in contemplation consists primarily of a repeated word or phrase. It's been the practice for centuries for Orthodox Christian, especially monks, to repeat the Jesus prayer. And with some variations, that prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And also, very familiar to Roman Catholic Christians is saying the Rosary, which Protestants don't do, but Catholics do. And that is a form of chanting. Now, Protestants haven't utilized this technique as much, except in music, where they love to repeat their favorite choruses. And this singing has the power to lift them to higher levels of consciousness. It only takes a few bars of Amazing Grace or How Great Thou Art for Christian believers to be lifted to higher spiritual level set as Protestant believers. So most often, then, mystics or contemplatives are those people who live in separation from a secular life in a monastery or a convent or some kind of religious community. But there have always been people with active lives, not living in separated situations, who are interested in going further than the norm in spirituality. So in modern Christianity, and you may have heard of this, you're also going to come across a kind of prayer that's called centering prayer. And this, too, is just another name for contemplation and meditation. And perhaps I'll mention centering prayer again in a later lesson. But you could probably, if you're really interested, find a centering prayer group in your area. This was a way that was developed to train people outside of the religious community to reach higher forms of consciousness, how to contemplate. Now, we could also use the term mystical prayer in the same way. This is deep contemplation. It's the prayer of the mystics. Now, there are lots of types of prayer, most of which you're familiar with. We're all familiar with the idea of adoration, which is, in our words or our thoughts, we're adoring God or adoring Jesus or the Holy Spirit. A thanksgiving, giving thanks for our lives, our experiences, our possessions. Praise is very similar to adoration, just expressing awe at the greatness of God. Then making requests, asking that our needs would be supplied. And finally, intercession, which is making requests that God would meet the needs of other people. Now, all of these are ways that religious people pray, but none of them are contemplation. Contemplation, the prayer of the mystics, begins where all of these kinds of prayers leave off. It begins when these prayers have been exhausted and we're ready to go on to the next level. And that's what this study is about, mystics going beyond and what they found when they did just that. In the webinars, I'll be letting the writings of the various mystics speak for themselves, sharing with us their distinct points of view and their wisdom. Now, why would this be any different than the wisdom that you would hear in your local religious service? Well, because the mystics have, as they intended, gone beyond the intellect to what is sometimes called spiritual intuition. And we'll hear more about that too as we make progress. But they have things to say that go beyond just thinking. I'm going to be quoting from these famous mystics, Saint Teresa of Avila, some people say Avila, Pseudo Dionysius, the anonymous writer of The Cloud of Unknowing, Meister Eckhart, and my favorite all-time mystic, Thomas Merton. When I send out the recording from this webinar, I'll send with it a list of books or possibly websites that I'll be using just in case you want to pick up any of them for your own use. I'll also be using a special text written by a 12-year-old boy. If you logged on early, you probably saw some quotes and photos that I used with samples of things that mystics say. And as we proceed, there'll be something about the lives of the mystics. Now, one of those quotes was Meister Eckhart. He said, let me just read a question here. Can you comment on meditation where the person's goal is to clear the mind of all thought rather than contemplation? Is that just a new age idea, or does it apply to Christian mystics? Actually, we're going to see a quote at the end of our lesson today. I think, maybe not, maybe it's next week. But one of the first things that the mystic has to do is to clear their mind of thought and emotion. And so it is probably the first step of contemplation, the same as it's the first step in meditation. The process is really, pretty much the same thing. It's not a new age idea, although meditation of different kinds has become very popular in people interested in the new age movement. But the beginning step of meditation, as we go through the different kinds, you'll see this. But one of the things is to go beyond our thinking and beyond our emotions so that our mind is in silence and expectation so that we can receive this unity that the mystic wants with God. And we'll see the mystic finds this unity in what they call the inner self. But that'll be a little far as we go a little farther on. That's a good question. Thank you. So I quoted, one of the quotes was Meister Eckhart, and he said, God is at home. We are the ones who have gone for a walk. I love that. It's so to the point. You know, the person is praying and saying, where's God? Well, God is at home. We're the ones who've gone for a walk. I love that imagery. It reminds me of the parable that Jesus told about the young man who left home and squandered his inheritance, and all the while he was gone, his father was waiting patiently at home for him. We call him the prodigal son. And the mystic spends his or her time finding the way back home. To them, that means much more than just attending religious services or performing a ritual, although they do both of those things, attend religious services and perform religious rituals. But this is a profound journey. As I've said, they're trying to go beyond. Now, as I begin this series, I'm going to presume that you don't know anything about the topic. That way I can cover everything and be patient if you're an expert in some of these areas and know it. Somebody else might just be hearing it for the first time. When I started reading the writings of mystics several years ago, that's where I was at. I didn't know anything. And so I think it's helpful to sort of start from the beginning and build precept upon precept. So who are these mystics that I keep talking about? Well, it's enlightening to know that they represent all religions and some people with no formal religious affiliation at all. It is not that they are not believers, but they may not belong to a particular religion. There are Jewish mystics. Their study is called Kabbalah or Kabbalah, whichever way you like to pronounce it. There are Islamic mystics in the Sufi tradition. There are, of course, Hindu and Buddhist mystics from all of their various sects. And of course, there are Christian mystics. Many of them are Roman Catholic, but in fact, most of the Christian mystics are from the Orthodox branch. And if somebody is what I'm calling a non-affiliated mystic, they're usually students of philosophy or theosophy. I'm only going to be quoting from Christian mystics because I'm presuming that most of the people who watch this will be from Christian background. Now, let's see, not all people who write books or make YouTube videos to teach about contemplation are mystics. And not all mystics write books or share their insights with us. Like all the subjects esoteric, when you investigate, you will come across some real wackadoos out there. But there's also lots of spiritual wisdom. One of the things that mystics teach is that discernment is really important. We need to learn to separate nonsense from true wisdom. So I have just two more words to define for you because I'll probably be using them as we go along. And then I'll let Thomas Merton give you some advice about getting started with contemplation. These words are exoteric and esoteric. And all religions, including the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all have exoteric and esoteric traditions. The easiest way to explain them is to say that the exoteric tradition is the public tradition presented to the masses, and the esoteric is the more private tradition reserved for a more interested few. Another term for esoteric is hidden. Now, why would a religion, any religion, have a hidden teaching? Well, one important reason is that it's often dangerous to disagree with powerful leaders. It can be life-threatening. It has been historically life-threatening to teach openly a message that's any different than the one that's currently held as orthodox. Even just a minor difference in teaching can cause a person to be called a heretic or get them into some kind of trouble. So a lot of times those people who had any kind of difference in belief went underground. And in a later lesson, I'll read instructions from a number of the mystic Christian texts telling the readers to keep what they were learning a secret. So how about the Bible? Is that in the Bible? Jesus told the 12 men who were in his inner circle that he was teaching the crowds in parables, but that he would reveal the true meanings and the deeper insights to them privately. This idea of esoteric and exoteric applies to all the major religions. It's interesting, though, in the amazing internet age, it's much easier to discover these teachings that in the past were hidden. Most of them now are online. And we live, especially in the United States, in a population that believes that everything should be accessible. And for the most part, if you're interested enough, you'll find what you're looking for. Now, whether we actually understand the teachings when we find them, well, that's a good question. So according to Thomas Merton, the first thing you need to do is to find an appropriate place to practice contemplation. Now, if you live alone or if you have segments of time alone in your home, that's no problem. But if you share living quarters, you're going to need to set aside a place where you can be alone and silent, or you'll need to search for a place like that somewhere outside your home. And so this is what he had to say about it. There should be at least a room or some corner where no one will find you and disturb you or notice you. You should be able to untether yourself from the world and set yourself free, loosing all the fine strings and strands of tension that bind you by sight, by sound, by thought, to the presence of other people. Then he quotes scripture. But you, when you pray, enter into your chamber, and having shut the door, pray to your Father in secret. And then he goes on. Once you've found such a place, be content with it. Do not be disturbed if a good reason takes you out of it, but love it and return to it as soon as you can. And do not be quick to change it for another. Well, for many people today, I want you to know that this is a really difficult task. It takes some maneuvering and planning because we're so busy. Our lives are so crowded with so many things. But it is important for us to make time for prayer, quiet time, and a space where we can be alone and still. We aren't just constantly in the company of other people, but we also have them attached to us in the form of cell phones and texts and chats and all sorts of instant contact to which they expect us to respond, and pretty quickly. So if we're going to have time alone, it needs to leave behind our gadgets and our noise. And since they're addictive, some people find this just incomprehensible. Contemplative prayer requires quiet surroundings. As a side note, though, some people do like to play some gentle instrumental music softly in the background to help block out any distant and sharp noises, but it has to be something that would not be distracting. Now, Merton had more to say. He says, let this be a place somewhere in which you can breathe naturally, quietly, and not have to take your breath in continuous short gasps, a place where your mind can be idle and forget its concerns, descend into silence, worship the Father in secret. There can be no contemplation, he says, where there is no secret. In one of his writings, Merton indicated that if you had access to an open church building, that's a good place to go and practice contemplation. But of course, today, most of our churches are kept locked, and we probably don't live that close to an open church building. But that's the kind of place you want, a gentle space with soft lighting, possibly dim lighting, and no disturbances. Now, in addition to that, if you have a place in your home that suits this purpose, it's nice to make it clearly such for yourself. Try to have an uncluttered space, perhaps bring in something from nature, a plant or some seashells or crystals or something, maybe a scented candle, a divine picture, or something that makes you think of spiritual things, a space that's set aside just for that. Maybe an icon, or maybe you don't want anything there at all, just a clean, clear space. Here where we live out in the woods, so outside of the windows, there's nothing but trees and grass and sometimes flowers. You might want to sit in front of a window if you have a lovely view, or maybe you live near the ocean or a stream. The idea isn't that there's any kind of rules to follow. It's just to make this space a sacred space to you, the place where you go to contemplate comfortably. In the next webinar, I'm going to explain, or I hope to explain, how we move from the exoteric forms of prayer. Those are the prayers we say together in church, the traditional prayers, or those prayers that I listed, the different types of prayer that we commonly use, to a more contemplative form. And we're going to see how St. Teresa of Avila describes this in her most famous book. It's called The Interior Castle. I want to close my part here with another quote from Thomas Merton that reiterates some of the points made in the lesson about the goal of contemplative prayer. And it kind of goes along with the question that was asked before. He says, one thing above all is important, speaking about this kind of prayer: the return to the Father. The Son came into the world that in him we might return to the Father, that we might pass clean out of all that's transitory and inconclusive, return to the immense, the primordial, the source, the unknown, to him who loves and knows, to the silent, to the merciful, to the holy, to him who is all. Merton says that to seek anything, to be concerned with anything but this, is only madness and sickness. For this is the whole meaning and the heart of our existence. And in this return to the Father, all the affairs of life, all the needs of the world and of people take on their right significance. All point to this one return to the source. The return to the Father, now, he says, is not to go back in time, not to roll up the scroll of history or to reverse anything. It's going forward, going beyond, because to merely retrace one's steps would be vanity on top of vanity, a renewal of the same absurdity in reverse. Our destiny is to go beyond everything, to leave everything, to press forward to the end with a capital E, meaning God, and find in the end our beginning, the ever new beginning that has no end. So we see here the goal of contemplative prayer is to leave behind the transitory and illusionary things of this life and enter into that one fulfilling relationship with God. I know that St. Teresa of Avila refers to it as a marriage, obviously not a physical marriage, but a deep and close intimacy with God that is like nothing else in the spiritual world. So that's what the mystics talk about. That's what they do.